In 2011, a peer-reviewed paper was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, one of the most respected journals in the field. The paper claimed to have found scientific proof that humans can see into the future. Not metaphorically, literally. The author was Daryl Bem, a Cornell professor with decades of publications behind him. The study passed peer review. It was published, and for a brief moment, the scientific community had to take it seriously. The real scandal wasn't the paper itself. It was what happened when other researchers tried to replicate it. They couldn't, and when they submitted their failed replications to journals, the journals didn't want them. Negative results weren't interesting enough to publish. That contradiction, a study about precognition passing peer review while rigorous disproofs got rejected, tells you almost everything you need to know about the state of modern psychology. Psychology has a problem, not a small one. Over the last decade, researchers have systematically gone back and tried to reproduce the findings that fill textbooks, TED Talks, and self-help bestsellers. The results are sobering. In 2015, the Open Science Collaboration attempted to replicate 100 published psychology studies. Only 36% showed results consistent with the original. 64% either failed outright or produced effects so weakened they were barely recognizable. This isn't a story about a few bad scientists. It's a story about a broken system, one that was designed, without anyone quite intending it, to produce exactly this outcome. To understand why, you need to understand something called the p-value. When a psychologist runs an experiment, they need a way to determine whether their result is real or just random noise. The standard tool is a statistical threshold. If the probability that your result occurred by chance is less than 5%, written as p less than 0.05, the result is considered statistically significant. It gets published. It becomes a finding. The problem is that this threshold is arbitrary. It was proposed by the statistician Ronald Fisher in the 1920s as a rough rule of thumb, not as a definitive line between truth and fiction. But science needed a gate, and 0.05 became that gate. The consequence is a system where the difference between a career-making finding and a null result is often a single decimal point. What happened next was predictable in hindsight. Researchers learned, not through conscious fraud, but through professional survival, how to work the system. If your first analysis doesn't cross the threshold, you try a slightly different one. You add a covariate. You remove an outlier. You reframe the hypothesis. Each individual decision seems defensible. Together, they constitute what statisticians call p-hacking, running enough variations on your data until something significant appears by chance. In a dataset with enough variables, something will always cross 0.05 eventually. That's not a finding, that's arithmetic. This pressure exists because of a dynamic known as publish or perish. Academic careers are built on publications. Grants follow publications. Promotions follow grants. And journals, which need readers, prefer surprising positive results over careful null findings. The system doesn't reward rigor, it rewards novelty. The consequences show up in studies you almost certainly know. Take power posing, the idea popularized by a 2010 study and one of the most watched TED Talks in history, that standing in an expansive posture for 2 minutes raises testosterone and lowers cortisol, physically altering your confidence. The study had 42 participants. When larger, more rigorous replications followed, the hormonal effects disappeared entirely. Dana Carney, one of the original co-authors, later published a public statement saying she no longer believed the effect was real. Or consider ego depletion, the theory that willpower is a limited resource, like a muscle that fatigues with use. It was one of the most influential ideas in social psychology for 2 decades, generating hundreds of follow-up studies. A large-scale replication attempt in 2016, conducted across 23 laboratories in 6 countries, found an effect so close to zero it was statistically indistinguishable from nothing. These aren't obscure studies. They shaped parenting advice, corporate training programs, and popular books. And they didn't fail because the researchers were incompetent or dishonest. They failed because the system they operated in was not designed to catch this kind of error. There is a second, quieter problem running underneath all of this. Even when studies do replicate, there is a deeper question about who they replicate on. The overwhelming majority of psychology research uses what researchers now call weird samples. Participants who are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. In practice, this often means undergraduate students at American or European universities. One analysis found that this group represents roughly 12% of the world's population, yet accounts for the vast majority of data used to make claims about universal human psychology. This matters because behavior is not always universal. Concepts like autonomy, self-esteem, and fairness play out differently across cultures. When a study conducted on students at Stanford is presented as evidence about how human beings think, that is not a scientific finding. It is an assumption dressed as one. Weird populations are often outliers on psychological measures, from visual perception to moral reasoning. We've built a map of the human mind skewed toward individualism and choice, not because these are universal traits, but because they are familiar to the people running the studies. There is a third structural problem that gets less attention, what researchers call the toothbrush problem. In most sciences, researchers build collectively on shared theoretical frameworks. In psychology, theories tend to be treated like personal property. No self-respecting researcher wants to use anyone else's. The result is a field that constantly reinvents the wheel, where phenomena are studied in isolation and findings rarely accumulate into anything more durable than a journal article. Without formal theoretical models that specify why something should happen, it becomes almost impossible to distinguish a genuine effect from a well-executed statistical accident. The cumulative effect of these problems produces what researchers call the decline effect, a strange but well-documented phenomenon where the size of a published effect tends to shrink the more it is studied. The first study finds a large, exciting result. The second finds something smaller. The third finds less still. What looks like a discovery gradually dissolves under scrutiny. This has led some researchers to argue that we are moving beyond a replication crisis into something more fundamental, a validation crisis. The question is no longer only whether an experiment can be repeated, it is whether the things psychology measures, concepts like grit, happiness, or self-control, actually exist in the way we define them. Without independent empirical validation, many reproducible findings may be measuring systematic error rather than real psychological phenomena. We are, in those cases, measuring the noise in the room rather than the signal we are looking for. It is worth being precise about what this crisis is and what it isn't. It is not evidence that science is corrupt, or that expertise cannot be trusted, or that all findings are equally unreliable. Some areas of psychology are on solid ground. Cognitive behavioral therapy has a robust evidence base. Basic perceptual and memory research holds up well, and statistical methods are actively improving. What the crisis reveals is something more specific, that popular psychology, the version that reaches the public through headlines, talks, and bestsellers, is systematically skewed toward results that are surprising, simple, and easy to story. The incentive structure of academic publishing selects for these results, and the media, which prefers clean narratives, amplifies them. The response within the scientific community has been substantial. Pre-registration, the practice of publicly documenting your hypothesis and analysis plan before collecting data, makes p-hacking detectable after the fact. Registered reports go further, requiring journals to accept or reject a study based on its methodology before the results are known. When the outcome is removed from the publication decision, researchers report null results roughly 60% of the time, compared to 10 or 20% in traditional journals. The difference tells you something important about how much the old system was suppressing inconvenient truths. But reform has its own complications. In late 2024, a high-profile paper by prominent open science advocates Brian Nosek and Jonathan Schooler was retracted from Nature after reviewers identified outcome switching and a lack of transparency about the study's origins. The researchers who had built careers championing scientific integrity had failed, at least in this instance, to meet the standards they advocated. Pre-registration only works if you follow your own pre-registration. This is not an argument for cynicism. It is an argument for a more precise kind of skepticism, one that asks not just whether a study exists, but how large the sample was, whether it has been replicated, whether the effect size is meaningful, and whether the population studied resembles the population the conclusion is being applied to. The next time you encounter a mind-blowing psychological finding, the kind that gets turned into a TED Talk or a chapter in a business book, those are the right questions to ask. Not because science is broken beyond repair, but because good science was never meant to produce simple answers. It was meant to produce better questions.